Hey, my name's Elise. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about why it's so hard to find jeans that fit. Now, I am taking this as a perspective from someone who sews, but anyone who has a hard time finding clothes that fit their body will benefit from the information in this video. But today we're talking specifically about jeans, why it can be hard to find the clothes that fit you, and how to find the right sort of style or rise cut to fit your body. So the first thing we're going to do is to look at our measurements. So I'm going to use myself as an example. You will need a measuring tape. So we're going to take our measurements and compare them against size charts and see if we can sort of pick the best type of jean that would fit us. So we're going to need a tape measure to get measured. If you happen to have a sewing kit and you have an elastic like this can be tied around your waist to help you find the narrowest point of your body. You don't have to have this. I have another trick that you can use if you don't have some elastic, but I would recommend grabbing a tape measure. All right, so I'm wearing just a thin t-shirt and regular jeans. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure the waist. So for women, your waist is the smallest part of your body. So for me, it's around here. If you have a hard time figuring out your waist, what you can do is bend over to the side, and if there's a part that dimples, poke in there and use that for your waist measurement. Again, this is helpful for folks who, if it's not super obvious where you want to measure your waist, but I've got it. I'll show you again here. Just where it dimples in, okay? So that's about here. So you'd measure around that. If you have elastic like this, it's actually really helpful to tie around your waist. And it will wiggle into the smallest spot. I also like to use an elastic like this if I'm taking more measurements for dressmaking. However, so now you can see where I'm going to measure my waist today, so you don't have to do that. You can use the trick I showed you where you just bend side to side, but this is wiggling right into the smallest part of my waist there, okay? So your waist may be higher up than you realize. We're not measuring exactly where the waistband of your jeans would fall. We're measuring your natural waist, which is different than a pants waist. And you also don't, just to keep in mind, you want it to be parallel to the floor. Mine tends to dip up in the back a little bit. And you want to breathe, okay? We don't want a vanity measurement where we're just sucking it all in, okay? So I'm about a 32-inch waist. Now we will measure the hip. A few notes on measuring your hip. I have fairly small hips. When you measure your hip, you want to make sure that you are measuring the widest part. So for me, it's not super obvious where my widest part is, so I'm just going to go with the biggest measurement. So for some people, I have a higher hip. My fullest part is fairly high up. Your fullest part of your hip may be a fair bit lower than mine. And again, when I turn around the back, it's dipped down. You want to make sure that it is parallel to the floor all the way around. So I have about 37-inch hip. So I want to explain a few things about measuring pants, waist, and hips for jeans and clothes. The distance between here and your waist is your rise, and we are going to be getting more into that. And some body shapes will have an easier time fitting certain rises than others. I actually have an easier time with mid or low rise. And I will explain why in a little bit. So you want the fullest part of your hip and the smallest part of your waist. If you're having a hard time finding the smallest part of your waist, bend over, poke, and measure where you poke. Okay, so I've gone and found a size chart online. This is from Levi's. So my measurement for my waist was 32 inches. So I want to let you know it's really normal to have a hard time finding clothes that fit your body because clothing sizes are made so that clothes can be mass produced, and clothing sizing has only been around for like roughly 100 years, especially for women's clothing. Before that, everything was custom made. Okay, so even sizes are like a fairly new phenomenon, like 100 years old. So mine is about 32. So that puts me a size like 12, 13 for my waist, but my hip is a 37, which puts me in a size 4 or 5. So I have a really hard time finding clothes that fit because I have such a straight body, which means that the difference between my waist and hip isn't that much. So if you look at most of these, most of them have about a 10-ish inch difference between the waist and the hip. It varies a little bit by size, but like usually around 9 or 10-inch difference between the waist and hip. And I only have about 5. So if you have a waist to hip, we call this a waist to hip ratio. So if your waist to hip ratio is more than, if you have a greater distance between your waist and hip, or difference in measurement, than like 9, 10 inches, you have a curvier body. I have a straighter body because I only have about 5 inches between my waist and my hip. So anyone who is outside of this sort of average, or it's almost like an algorithm for clothes to have like a 9-inch difference between the waist and the hip. Think of clothing sizing as like an algorithm, right? Everyone loves to hate the algorithm. So yeah, that's why it's hard to find clothes that fit. And so if that's the case with you, for the most part, like you might have to go kind of in between sizes, or you may have to go up and fit the waist, and maybe just try and find cuts that fit you. And we'll get a bit more into that in a sec. So I want to talk a little bit about different rises for jeans. So as we talked about earlier, most sizes are made assuming that women have a 9 to 10-inch difference between their waist and hip. So if that's the case, then someone would have a sort of average body type or body shape. Anyone who's curvy there's a plus here, greater than the 9 to 10-inch difference between their waist and hip measurement, or a straighter body, which is what I am, where I only had 5-inch difference. So their waist to hip was like smaller than 8 inches. So mine was about 5. Now I want to talk a bit about how the rise of pants can affect your body shape. Or for example, for me, where I'm a bit more like this, I have a hard time finding high-waisted jeans. So here's someone's natural waist, curvy or straight. Okay, and their hip is like down here. Okay, so a pair of jeans that is high rise might go to about here. Okay, so you can see the distance here is the smallest part of the waist, and a mid-rise would be about this, right? And low rise. So you can see how much smaller the waist at the high rise would be. See how much smaller it is here than here. So this was actually the waistband of your pants. So someone with a straighter body would have, so if they tried on the same pair and what should be their size, this very well may end up being too small on them here. But perhaps because their waist doesn't curve in as much, like I have an easier time with actually low-rise jeans because it doesn't take into account the fact that my waist is straighter than what the pants are made for. So someone who does have the 9 to 10-inch difference might not have this problem at all. So someone who has a curvy body they're more likely to have a back gap. So that means that they might have to buy things to fit their hip, and then the waist ends up being too big and they end up having a bunch of space in the back. So they might have an easier time with a high rise because high rise jeans tend to be shaped more like this. So if you take a pair of high-rise jeans in the store and you look at them and compare them to the same size in a lower-rise jean, you'll often find that the waistband is much smaller than for a high-rise style than a low-rise style, because it's designed for a smaller waist, and the waist gets bigger as you go down. So that's why someone with a straighter body usually has an easier time with pants that are lower rise, and someone with a curvier body might have, or especially someone who is prone to the back gap, like the back gaps because the waist is too big compared to their hip, they might have an easier time with a high rise because those are made for a smaller waist size up here versus the lower body. One more thing I wanted to point out as well is that different people, even with the same measurements, might have clothes that fit them differently. So let's pretend that this is a circumference of a tape measure around someone's hip measurement. You can have people with a wider hip and a flatter seat, and have someone with narrower hips and a rounder seat and still have the same measurement around here. So when you measure your body and look at the size chart, if you're more like this with narrower hip side to side but fuller in the seat versus flatter in the seat but fuller hips, you might still, like, this is still the same amount of string here. This is still the same measurement, but because your body is shaped differently, you may still have trouble or different experience with someone else who measures the same with clothes that fit. So this is all to show you that measurements are just numbers, and you can work with your body instead of against it by trying to choose styles, especially a rise that works with your body. And it's also really, really normal to have a hard time finding things that fit. I sure do, and I explained why over here, because my waist to hip ratio, my body is much straighter here than what most clothes are made for, and there's a lot of folks that have